Okay, well, I think we're ready to begin. So this is our Quackery Comms and Science Moms panel, as we're terming it. So when I was thinking about putting this panel together, I was thinking skepticism is primarily about trying as best we can to figure out what's true from what's false and to ensure that the things that we think and that we believe are as correct as they could possibly be. But it's not really enough to just clean up our own conclusions and to have the right answers. It's also incumbent upon us as skeptics to try and spread those good answers as far as we can, because there's certainly no shortage of people trying to spread bad answers, the wrong answers around. So joining me today to talk about how ideas, good and bad, can be spread is a panel with a variety of backgrounds. And I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves individually, one by one, starting with David. And if you could, perhaps tell us if there's a particular form of pseudoscience or trend in pseudoscience that currently concerns you the most.
Okay, I'm David Gorksi. I'm a breast cancer surgeon and managing editor of Science-Based Medicine, as well as a breast cancer researcher. A form of pseudoscience that most concerns me, there are so many. I seem to spend an inordinate amount of time on anti-vaccine, so.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Britt Hermes. I am a former quack and turned budding scientist and new skeptic. I am currently completing a PhD program in evolutionary genomics, and I'm studying the mammalian microbiome. And what I'm noticing is that there's a lot of pseudoscience in microbiome world, especially around probiotics. So this is sort of my new niche, my new pet project, so to speak. But I think I'm most concerned about pseudoscience around cancer treatment, because this is where one that I have personally witnessed harm and I think can do just a lot of emotional damage, financial damage, and plus, of course, the patients can lose their life.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Natalie Newell. I am a filmmaker. I made the Science Moms documentary, and I also co-host a podcast, the Science Enthusiast Podcast. And for me, the pseudoscience that I guess I spend the most time on is sort of the food-related stuff, like the anti-GMO and super pro-organic, clean eating, all of those buzzwordy things. And like probably everybody else, the anti-vax stuff is just infuriating and dangerous and scary. So all those things.
Great.
Hi, I'm Caroline Rance. It was great to see lots of you at my talk earlier on. I run a website called The Quack Doctor, which looks at historical health fraud. And so I focus on mostly the Victorian era. I have a couple of books out as well. There's The Quack Doctor, Historical Remedies for All Your Ills, and The History of Medicine in 100 Facts, which is available to buy on level 3. I think because I focus very much on the past, I'm not so engaged in skeptical activism as a lot of people here. But I think the form of pseudoscience that particularly annoys me at the moment is everything related to autism and the extremely dangerous remedies that are being promoted. Yes, there's the anti-vax aspect of it, but there's also some extremely harmful supposed remedies being promoted. I have a little boy who has got Asperger's, so I'm quite interested in that kind of thing.
Okay, and for myself, I'm Michael Marshall. I'm the project director of the Good Thinking Society, so I'm a full-time skeptic working for a skeptical charity. And I think the form of pseudoscience that I find the most disturbing, certainly at the moment, is the trend we're seeing of the people who are fundraising to be sent to a quack clinic to cure their cancer.
Yeah.
We see them in the media all the time, and there are huge, huge numbers of these. And I think alternative cancer cures is something that we as skeptics might not see a lot of, because a lot of these conversations are happening in closed Facebook groups that we're not part of, or in forums that we're not part of. So that's the stuff that, that particularly disturbs me. And this is our panel. So, David, if I could start with you, David. You've been blogging about this whole area for more than a decade, and I dare say your interest extends beyond that too.
Well, go ahead, what was it?
Yeah, well, sure. I was just going to say, what common factors have you noticed in how quack ideas spread? So when we see pseudoscientific ideas, what tropes and trends have you seen in, or commonalities between different types of pseudoscience? Is there anything we can track between them?
Well, certainly hostility toward the scientific consensus is pretty much universal. You can look at it, whether it's anti-evolution, whether it's quackery, whether it's anti-vaccine, whether it's whatever, climate change, climate science denialism. There's always a hostility towards the scientific consensus. That's one. Portraying oneself as the persecuted underdog is another frequent trope that comes up. Secret knowledge. You remember what's his name, Trudeau, from like more than 10 years ago.
Kevin Trudeau, I think it was.
The natural cancer cures that they don't want you to know about. Those are three that come to mind immediately.
Yeah. Natalie, obviously you created the documentary Science Moms, which I had the pleasure of watching in the run-up to this. And in there you interview 5 scientists about conversations around GMOs, vaccines, organic food, homeopathy, all that kind of stuff. Did you get a sense in making that what factors tend to drive people to seek out pseudoscience, and what factors pseudoscientists are capitalizing on to promote their ideas?
I mean, I think that the pseudoscience pushers definitely capitalize on this weird fear narrative that's permeated the culture, where everybody wants to do what's right for themselves, for their children, whatever. And I feel like the woo people and the pseudoscientists have done a really good job of telling a story and appealing to the hearts and minds of people and saying, we have the right thing, we have the natural thing, we have the cure that everyone else has been hiding. It's like distrust for science, and because
they're very good at tapping into our lizard brain.
They really are, and they tug on the heartstrings, and they do it so effectively, especially to parents. Coven had a great slide up at her talk just before this by Zen Honeycutt from Moms Across America, saying that she trusts social media more than she trusts scientists? Mm-hmm. She doesn't need a scientific study because personal research, social media, memes, David Wolfe, all the things are so much more appealing than But this is the thing that parents and people are getting to.
It's
other narrative.
It's anecdotes over science.
Absolutely, yeah.
People love a good story. I mean, it's built into our brains, and
yeah.
Anecdotes are actually more powerful than dry science, so you have to find a way to connect it. And equally or more compelling story to.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Britt, if I could bring you in at this point, you have a unique perspective because you trained as a pseudoscientist, as a naturopath. So how much of that training actually involved talking about the ways in which you communicate these ideas to people, the techniques to communicate and to spread these ideas? Is this something you were specifically trained on, or did you just sort of pick it up as you were expected to pick it up as you go along?
Well, both. But I thought about this starting last night, and so I actually went back to my transcripts from Bastyr University, which is a naturopathic, air quote, medical school in Seattle where I trained. And I looked at my transcript to try to get a sense of what was sort of overt counseling skills and, playing into this doctor-patient relationship, and then the other classes that didn't maybe have it in the title, but these ideas were taught. So I took half a dozen classes that focused on counseling, either motivational interviewing and just sort of nurturing this patient-doctor relationship. And then I took over a dozen more classes that didn't necessarily have it in the title, but where these themes were brought in. And so these include classes like naturopathic clinical therapy, psychological assessment, where the basis of the class was really teaching us how to connect with the patient in order to extract information that we needed. And then it gets even worse, actually, if you start to think about the pseudoscience classes that we were taught, where this theme is just imperative to practicing that form of alternative medicine. So homeopathy, for example, you can't prescribe a homeopathic remedy unless you have this really nice rapport with the patient, where the patient trusts you enough to tell you really bizarre things like if they sweat at night, or how many bowel movements they have a day, or all of these odd things that actually takes a lot of time to extract from your patient. And then there's a whole series of modeling that is presented to us. So we're required to go to the Bastyr Clinic as students to experience what it's like to get alternative medicine treatment as a patient. And so then this is modeled to you very explicitly, like this is how you play doctor. And then over the course of the 4 years, you're constantly in this environment of this is how you should do medicine. This is how you should approach healthcare. And it's not about the therapy really so much as it's about developing some sort of very special relationship with your patient so that you have absolute authority in that situation, so that when the time comes to recommend a sugar pill, the patient's like, okay, I'll take that because I trust you, and now this patient has told you their most deepest, darkest, intimate secrets, and they've invested in you, and they really want to believe you no matter what at this point.
Yeah, and Caroline, this is something I think fits relatively well with your area of research. So is this something that is a new phenomenon, the idea of kind of building that interpersonal relationship? Is this what we've seen throughout the history of quackery, or would they use other techniques back then?
There were a variety of techniques, but building up a personal relationship was always important, particularly in homeopathy and history. Right from the beginning, you would have to have an hour-long interview with your patient, going into lots of details about how they felt and what was wrong with them. And so that did build up the relationship, which meant that they would then trust you, just as Britt was saying. So that dates back to the beginnings of homeopathy. But there was also a sense of anonymity as well, which I was talking about a little bit earlier, that one of the attractions of buying a quack remedy was that you could just go and buy it without talking to anybody, and that often suited people very much as well, especially if they had something that they didn't want everybody else to know that they had. So there is quite a range of responses in the history.
Yeah, the personal relationships I think is quite interesting, and it reminds me of I was involved in a patient consultation about the provision of homeopathy in the local area, and we were challenging that as a charity, and I was there in the meeting with people who were part of the homeopathy service, and what really struck me was listening to one particular patient who said that I tried this therapy. Well, my doctor said I've got this condition, so they gave me these pills, and when that didn't work, he just gave me some other pills, and when that didn't work, he gave me some other pills, and that just made me feel like I was a lab rat being bounced from pillar to post. So then I went to a homeopath, and they talked about everything, and they tried this, and that wasn't quite right, so we discussed it a bit more, and we tweaked it, and we tried this thing over here, and then that didn't work.
Now, I've written about this before, about how homeopathy is, a lot of it is basically make shit up as you go along. But how is that different from the doctor changing, trying a pill, seeing it doesn't work, and then tries another one?
I can tell
It really is. Well, hopefully the doctor has a scientific basis for what he's doing. But the other thing is like the level of trust, the personal relationship.
So in my experience, because I did recommend homeopathic remedies to patients, one of the things that I think I learned from Bastyr, besides patient blaming, which is a whole separate thing, when the patient would come back to me and perhaps wasn't better, there was a really lengthy discussion about how perhaps I, as the practitioner, didn't recommend the right remedy. And I think the patient witnessing that responsibility, I think, is emotionally meaningful for the patient. Now, I'm just sort of guessing because I can't say for certain. But when the patient would come to me and say, I'm not better, or maybe we need to think of something else, it also included a lot more counseling, and going deeper. And then it's a long-term relationship. It's a long-term therapeutic relationship that you're building with this patient. But the other thing that alternative doctors do quite commonly is we blame the patient. We say, oh, well, did you brush your teeth the same day that you took the homeopathic remedy? Because menthol can disrupt the homeopathic properties. Or do you drink coffee? Because coffee can also disturb it. So you're probably just nullifying the therapy, and so you have to try again.
So you had a reason for everything.
Oh yeah,
everything.
Yeah.
So it's like con artistry to the extreme.
It even goes so far as, well, do you live close to power lines? Do you live close to?
So
do you live close to the freeway? Did you have pizza? Maybe it was the gluten in the pizza. I mean, we can literally make up an excuse for anything.
Are you a person? You did something wrong.
I mean, the practitioner often believes what they're saying. It's not that they're just picking out of the air.
Both sides are the conned in this, pretty much.
It's funny, well, it's not funny, it's actually horrible that I sat through a presentation by Patrick Vickers, who runs the Gerson Clinic in Mexico. He visited Liverpool relatively recently, and that patient blaming really stood out there, because what he was saying is, here's this incredibly complicated Gerson regime.
I was going to say, you're probably not familiar with the Gerson therapy, right? Are you? Some of you may be.
So Gerson,
they know.
It's huh?
Do you want to explain Gerson briefly?
Yeah, I mean, basically, it is, as he says, a very rigorous, long. It involves 12 or 13 glasses of freshly made juice. Juice either from vegetables or fruits. It involves 5 coffee enemas a day. It involves something like 100 supplements a day. Yeah. It's
nothing.
So we had Patrick Vickers saying, dead easy. So we had Vickers saying, no, you have to stick to this. And what he said was, if you do this for 30 days and you slip up on even one day, it will not work. It will not cure your cancer. And there's cancer patients in the room. And I even saw some cancer patients online talking afterwards saying, I understand now why it wasn't working. I had a chat with him. I understand what I did wrong, and I'm going to get back on the regime. So that victim blaming, that patient blaming is a big part of it. But Britt, how much of that is intentional, do you think? And how much of it is kind of goes along with, I've been taught I must be right, so this must be what's happening, rather than it's all wrong?
I believe this must work, so there must be something interfering.
There's certainly a part of that. We're trained this way, and we've invested a lot of time and a lot of money into it. We believe it ourselves. And so this explanation that the patient is at fault is much easier, right, than looking critically at our own actions and coming up with it. There's a really ugly piece to this, though, that I don't think anybody would be willing to admit, except for me, is that it's also a very important part of our business plan. And so as an alternative medicine practitioner treating any kind of disease, we need repeat business. So we specialize in cancer and autoimmune diseases and things like chronic fatigue and things that are not really easy to address in medicine, because there's a lot of repeat business for us there. And just based on human nature, we're going to mess up. I mean, we're going to come into contact with power lines or drive on the freeway, or even though we're undergoing alternative cancer therapy, our best friend invited us over for a glass of wine, so you want to go and have a glass of wine with your best friend on a Friday night, and you go back to your naturopath on Monday morning, and according to your naturopath, you kind of derailed your entire cancer treatment. And these are some of the things that the cancer quack that I worked with in Arizona would actually say to patients. And so I've seen the emotional harm that this causes, and the patients would literally be sitting in we called it the IV room, where we had these big lazy boy chairs where they would get different intravenous cocktail injections of herbal medicines and vitamin C's, and be sobbing because they just had a conversation with the naturopath, the cancer doctor, who told them that they're not getting better, and it's probably because over Christmas break they decided to eat Christmas cookies and have wine to celebrate family being in town. But at the same time, they're coming back to this cancer doctor, this fake cancer doctor, over and over and over. It's sort of just like, you're just torturing yourself by going back through it, because they also are terrified of conventional therapy.
I can attest to this. It's perhaps the single bit, just that now, I don't have research to cite for this, but just from personal, seeing patients, the single biggest thing that makes patients think about alternative medicine is fear of chemotherapy.
Yeah, for sure.
I think that fear element is...
And I mean, I'm a surgeon, so I say, in actuality, at least in breast cancer, surgery is actually one of the easier parts of the treatment. The chemotherapy is a lot rougher.
And so typically people would get surgery and then come to get alternative cancer care, and then call it integrative, right? Because they chose to get surgery.
And that's another way that it works, though, because for instance, a lot of cancers, surgery is basically the cure. The reason for the chemotherapy is not to cure it, but to decrease the risk of it recurring. And so, like I say, for instance, it's like a stage 2 breast cancer. It has like an 80% chance of being, with all treatment has like about an 80% chance of being fine. Without the chemotherapy, it might be more like 70% chance of being fine. So there, you hear from the ones who were lucky, and the odds are actually mostly in their favor, and in some cases that they won't recur without the chemotherapy, but they're taking away, their best shot.
I think that fear and that unpleasantness is a big driver too. I mean, in the same room when I was in that cancer conference, there was a lady there who said, well, I had breast cancer, I had the surgery, they said I also needed chemotherapy, but I didn't want to do the chemotherapy. Now my cancer's back, which showed that the surgery didn't work, so now I know conventional medicine doesn't work, I'm going to try alternative medicine, because she hadn't followed it all through. But I think our fear is a big part of it. And Natalie, that was something that came through really strongly in Science Moms, is that we're talking about selling these things or pushing these things because of playing on people's fear.
Yeah, playing on people's fears, and then also presenting these alternatives in this sort of wholesome package, and often using celebrities, using just, I don't know, I guess science doesn't necessarily connect with people. Gwyneth Paltrow somehow connects with people to where, like, people are doing really weird things and sticking things in their bodies where they really shouldn't. But that somehow in our culture, we live in this celebrity-driven culture that people will grab onto that because they're presenting this sort of comfortable alternative to the scary conventionally grown produce or to scary conventional real medicine. And so their narrative is kind of warm and fuzzy sometimes. The facts are not always warm and fuzzy. And so for me with the film, it's like, let's try to present the facts in a way that can connect with people. Maybe not the same way that, some of the wooey mommy stuff connects with people, but in a way that, we're real people too, with just a different message, but like we really care too, kind of thing.
I think that comfort, that celebrity aspect, that's very important. And Caroline, is this a new thing? We tend to think of our age as being kind of uniquely defined by celebrity. Is this something we've seen common throughout Quackery's history?
Yes, so for example, talking about parenting, in about the 1840s to the 1870s, there was a product called Atkinson & Barker's Royal Infants Preservative. And this was something that was supposed to help parents to help their baby feel better when they were going through teething. Teething was a really dangerous time, not because of the teething itself, but because a child of that age was really prone to lots of different diseases, and child mortality was really high. So teething was associated with this time of mortality. And products like Atkinson and Barker's generally contained opium, so that would quieten the child down, they would appear to be calm, and it did have genuine pain-relieving effects.
So you're saying it worked?
Yeah. It had genuine pain-relieving effects. But the way that this would be promoted was with pictures of the Queen and the princesses and their children. So you were supposed to aspire to be like these royal mothers. There were also... as I said in my talk earlier about opera singers being used to promote certain products for chest complaints. So that is quite a long established thing that you would look up to people and want to be like them and buy a product.
And the fear as well, I guess, is a long-established thing too. That we've
Yeah,
always
very
saw
much
fear.
so. Another product for parents was called Fennings cooling powders. That one didn't actually contain opium, but it was the same sort of idea that it was supposed to help with teething. And their adverts literally said, "Do not let your child die." That was the headline of the advert. So it was making you think that without products like this, it just wasn't worth risking not using them. And there was a lot of talk in the Victorian era about opium, and a lot of politicians were doing quite a bit of hand-wringing about the amount of opium products that were being used for babies, particularly in the working class. And yet there was something of a tradition of feeling that these products were actually beneficial. So people weren't using them out of stupidity or gullibility, but because these ideas have been passed on through generations, that opium products would help the child thrive. So you would have to really be taking quite a risk to depart from that. You wouldn't want to sort of not give them that, and then there's a fairly high likelihood that they would die of something anyway. So I think people really wanted to try and give their child the best chance.
And it seemed, I mean, I guess it just changes as time goes on too. Some things stay the same and some things change, but the way information now is passed on, so there were advertisements with the Queen or other prominent figures. Now we have social media where everyone all the time is telling you what you should do. And, when you look and you want to do the right thing, and as a parent, there's just so much conflicting information. And that's where when people choose the dangerous option, I'm thinking people who, instead of giving your babies opium, now people are saying, take your baby to a chiropractor or things like that. That's just, there are videos on the internet of babies getting chiropractic treatment and it's out there. And so, to me, that's scary because I'm like, that baby is getting their back cracked, for lack of a better way to put it. But for some people, they're viewing that as, that's what I need to do to be a good parent.
Yeah, and that's something that we find here in the UK. One of the projects that we as Good Thinking Society ran was to do undercover phone calls to chiropractors to say, I've got this baby, they've got colic, I'm not quite sure, can't really sleep at the moment, is there anything you can do? And we found just widespread throughout the chiropractic industry, yes, bring your baby down, we'll give it an adjustment, that'll cure the colic, you should be bringing your baby down from the moment it's born. It's just, these are messages that get passed around the industry routinely.
Yeah, and that was told to me as a parent by a fellow parent. When they heard my child crying, oh, have you thought take him to a chiropractor? This was when my son was about 4 months old.
So I'd like to take a question from the audience, if we do have one. We have one here. Are we on the throwing mic? Brilliant. Can you catch this? This is the microphone.
Okay, I have not seen this before at a conference.
This is new to me too, so if it breaks, I'm not taking any responsibility. It's one of your faults, effectively. But yeah.
I do know that we skeptics like to refrain from using the same methods as the other side, so to say. But can we operate on that theory as well? Is it ethical to operate on the theory? There is a project that originated from the Australian skeptics a couple of years ago, and it ended up being an international project with making subtitles, the Vaccination Chronicles. And that operates on that same idea of planting the fear in people from something that they don't know about. So what do you think of that? Using the same weapon against them.
Yeah. Just put it on the floor for now. We'll throw it around after. Okay, who in the panel wants to pick up the fear question?
I'll start, but hopefully other people will jump in. I was thinking about this actually over the weekend, and the conclusion that I came to was this. The ethical problem, I think, boils down to spreading misinformation. It's not necessarily about using fear, right? At least this is sort of what I'm thinking about, and maybe we'll have a heated debate. But it isn't necessarily about using fear, because I think sometimes the effective message needs to be communicated in different ways. And from personal experience, it was fear that allowed me to see things differently. So if I wasn't scared out of my mind, I don't know that I could have taken in the information that I needed in order to make a change. So the ethical problem for the alternative medicine side, I think, is the spread of misinformation. So as long as we're not spreading misinformation, I'm sort of, I feel many ways about using fear or love or empathy or whatever, humor or whatever we need in order to help reach the person sitting across from us.
Does anyone else want to sort of weigh in on the fear question?
I think, to me, using fear in that way seems a little counterintuitive because it does raise those ethical questions. But I think there is definitely a lot that we can learn from practitioners. One thing I think a lot of people who go to alternative practitioners want is to feel that they're being listened to. And I think that providing more opportunities for people to feel heard, to have their concerns addressed, is one way in which we can perhaps learn from so-called quacks.
The issue, of course, as Britt says, is no misinformation. However, how you use the fear, you have to be careful. You don't want to exaggerate in a way that they say, and you have to remember, for instance, in the vaccines, vaccines are kind of a victim of their own success. So most of these parents have never seen most of the diseases that we vaccinate against. They have seen kids with autism, every single one of them. And most of them probably know mothers who think that vaccines cause their child's autism.
Well, I wonder as well whether the distinction isn't necessarily directly between about using fear, but there's a distinction there between rational fear and irrational fear. Because I think what pseudoscientists trade on extensively is irrational fear. This GMO product is going to harm you. Whereas and at the same time, they're trading on irrational comfort or irrational ideas of safety, like your child isn't going to get measles, measles isn't that bad, so the vaccine's worse. So I think if we're trading on fear, the only fear we should ever think about trading on would be rational fears, or at least awareness of risks rationally. So people who might think that measles is no big shakes, to point out to and actually say, this is what measles is actually like. We see people using black salve to try and cure their skin cancer, and they don't seem to worry about the fact that it literally burns and rots holes in your skin. People have far less fear of that than they ought to have. They've got an irrational lack of fear.
As a surgeon, I've always been blown away by this. For instance, you have a melanoma. The treatment is to cut it out with a margin of normal tissue, and both around it and deep enough, and to check the lymph nodes. Okay, someone throws some black salve on the melanoma and burns it away. That can actually work. But it's disfiguring. It's like, instead of being clean and precise, and you pull the skin together and close it, you're left with this big nasty scar and burn, and you're disfigured.
Yeah, and also you're not picking up any metastases,
right?
Because it takes time to act, whereas surgery is obviously going to be much quicker, really.
And really, all you have to do is just, I think, show people pictures of what that looks like. That's not, capitalizing hardcore on fear. That's just a fact. It's like, this is what this treatment does to you. Yeah. This is what measles looks like. Just put it out there. Like, you don't even have to exaggerate and go overly scary with it, because to just look at this, it has to have somebody with a rational brain can pause and say, I don't want to do that to myself. And I think there are people who probably aren't necessarily going to be reached with, like, the hardcore anti-vaxxers. We're probably not going to change their minds because we're part of the big pharma conspiracy.
I don't even try.
So it's to reach the people in the middle, and that's why I think to go too extreme on the fear, you risk alienating people that you might bring in otherwise. So to have some balance of knowing that people are just scared and they don't know who to trust with information. So I think my personal approach is to tread as lightly as possible while still giving the facts and understand most people are coming from a good place and just wanting to do the best they can for themselves and their families.
I think the flip side of fear, in a way, is certainty. And I think one of the things that I'd like the panel to discuss really is that people are driven to pseudoscience because that offers certainty. It's false certainty. But if you go and see a doctor or an oncologist, and they might say, well, you have a 60% chance of a 10-year survival, which is, might be seem reasonable. Whereas you go and see a naturopath and they'll say, no, that's nonsense. This will 100% cure you. They're wrong, but I could see how that certainty is seductive.
Yeah, I mean, practicing science-based medicine, we're kind of constrained by the facts and by science. So, if you say a patient comes to you and says, what are my odds, and you say, well, at stage this cancer, you have like an 80%, 10-year survival, which, and they'll be, you mean there's a 20% chance I could die? It's. And the answer is yes, absolutely. I routinely tell patients with like early stage 1 cancers who have like a 95%, survival. I tell them, can this kill you? Yes. Is it very likely to? No. That is if you get it treated.
Do we have another question from the audience? You've got the box of power.
Yeah, I've listened to a lot of UK and American opinions on the subject, but I get the feeling that the position on GM seems to be a bit more polarised in the USA. And is it inconceivable that in the future such a good tool could be used for malign intent?
Who wants to pick that up?
I feel like you're the GMO person.
Oh, everyone's looking at me. So can biotechnology be used like for evil, Jurassic Park style?
Well, and CRISPR and
Yeah.
Cosmic particles.
Yeah, I mean, I guess any tool can be used for.
But I get the feeling it's more polarized.
Yeah, and I think
in
that
US podcasts that I listen to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of the narrative that has been built up around it is that, I don't know if it comes from the idea of Monsanto and corporate control over our food or whatever it is, whatever the reason. Yeah, it is definitely a polarizing type of thing, but people don't realize it's a tool that can have larger impacts in the world if we took a more rational approach to it. I mean, we're making decisions, as a society, that it is this polarizing, possibly dangerous tool. And there are, people in Uganda whose banana crops are dying because of it. I would like to see it become less polarizing and for people to understand that if the tool is used for good, it can really have a larger global impact. But that involves changing the narrative away from kind of the march against Monsanto, non-GMO project, all the sanctimonious bullshitty stuff that goes along with it. But I don't know if I'm totally answering your question because I don't know what the future would hold, but I think my hope is that the narrative could shift. Like science communicators, skeptics, rationally minded people to change and understand it's just a tool. Any tool can be used for good or for bad.
Well, I think that the people who are opponents of it are using all the same kind of tactics of fear and certainty, and it's the thing that David says that 80% of this might be incredibly beneficial. What 20% is going to be dangerous to society? People are still looking for the other side of it, really. So I think maybe the key is decoupling the technique from the technician.
Yeah.
And say this is a tool that can be used by people. Yes, it can be used for terrible things, but it can be used for phenomenally good things.
Right,
we need to make sure that we regulate the technicians, not necessarily the technique.
You can use a hammer to build a house or hit somebody over the head. That's a tool. Like you can make a decision with what you do with the tool, and biotechnology is a tool. So let's just hope we don't have dinosaurs running around. But really, I think that it's all in how you use the tool.
Are there any Germans in the audience? So it's my impression as an American living in Germany that it's a very polarizing issue in Germany as well. The bio movement, which is the organic movement in Germany, is huge. It's permeated its way into the scientific community. I have colleagues who don't understand what GMO means and think that bio is inherently better, healthier. So there's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding, and I think it is quite a polarizing topic in Germany and also in France. It's also, from what I understand, there's a big division in France as well.
So I'd like to take another question from the audience. Before that, I've got one question that I just want to sort of address Caroline's way, because it speaks to something that we talk about a lot in skepticism, the idea that a lot of these pseudoscientific ideas are unsinkable rubber ducks. So are there ducks that have been sunk? Do we have examples in history of things that were around that were successfully sunk, and what sunk them? Can we learn from how to sink these things?
I think some of the fashions of the mid-Victorian era, like phrenology and mesmerism, we don't tend to see them around, but it's not, I don't know if we can really...
They have evolved.
Yes, exactly, yeah. They do move on to something else, and we can't guarantee that they won't suddenly bob up on some celebrity's website again in the next year or whenever. I think things like mesmerism, it was just people gradually educating about how this didn't work, and also phrenology. I think it was just over time people realised that it didn't work. I don't think there were many that anyone actually bopped them on the head and it was suddenly over. I think things do just evolve and people move on to the next fashion, which is not necessarily a good thing. It could be something completely different and maybe worse.
So do we have a question from the audience? We have one all over there. How good your throwing arm? No, we'll pass it rather than throw it. Actually, if that's all right. Lovely stuff. It is nice and soft, so don't worry too much. There we go. Fantastic.
Thanks. So something that I see in a different field is when communicating with people is the use of phrases with which no one can disagree. And I'm wondering, do you see that a lot in pseudoscience, and is it something we should use as skeptics?
Who wants to pick up this?
Like we all want what's best for our children or something like that?
So yeah, exactly. Just having, so I'm thinking of political pledges. If you see a good political leaflet, it will have pledges on, and they're all things that no one can disagree with. You know, protecting our children's education, things like that.
I mean, is this something that came up in your training, Britt? Because obviously this kind of language does occur an awful lot through Quackery.
Maybe. I mean, I don't know if it's overt, like we should say things that everybody can agree with, but I think what happens is that we have to pretend that we are articulate, and we have to pretend that
I like how you paused before saying that. That was brilliant.
We have to pretend like we know what we're talking about, and so we default to these phrases because there's really nothing else to say. There's no substance behind it. And so we're saying something like, whether it's, you know, we all want, you know, world peace, or we all want the best education for our children, or this is an inflammatory modulator. You know, there's
well, no,
which is a real thing, but we don't have anything underneath that. And so what we end up doing is hijacking these phrases and applying it to whatever it is that we're talking about because we're forced to in order to sell something.
I mean, I was at a conference several years ago where I met someone whose job it is to coach pundits. And the thing he told me about being a pundit on the air is that you never, ever show doubt. You never, ever admit you're wrong. You never admit even a little bit of nuance. You are correct. You know?
That's the antithesis of what we're trying to do as skeptics, effectively, yeah.
But this comes across.
It's
I learned,
authoritative.
Yeah. We weren't taught this explicitly, but you learn very quickly in the context of a patient visit that as soon as you say, I don't know, or provide nuance to the treatment or the situation or your decision making, you're not going to make the sale, whether that's the IV treatment or the supplement. So you learn in order to pay off your student loan bills and to pay your mortgage that you have to sort of embrace as much authority as possible. So I think I can't really think of anything, but I'm sure I use these phrases just to pretend like I knew what I was doing.
Well, I guess it's an extension of that question almost, is about rhetoric generally. Is that maybe do we as skeptics focus on fact over rhetoric? Are we conveying science? And I wonder how much we've seeded the rhetoric. So you can have the anti-GMO movement or the anti-vax movement painting themselves as being pro-children, concerned parents, and I'm sure they're largely made up of concerned parents, but we have concerned parents on our side, concerned that their kids aren't getting vaccinated. So are we seeding the rhetoric because we're focusing on the science too much, and do we need to move back into a rhetoric space maybe?
Well, I think before you can have that conversation with somebody about why they should vaccinate their children, I think you need to make some sort of personal connection with them. And like, so Britt, what you learned in school, how you had to play doctor and how you had to have all those conversations, I feel like that's the part of the woo movement that we, you know, if we embrace that a little bit more, like just personal anecdote. My kids go to a preschool. I was talking to a parent and we were just having a common ground sort of conversation first. She asked me what I do, and I was like, I made this film. And I told her what it was about, and I think because she realized I'm just a normal human, like playing on the playground with my kids, she's like, I don't know if I want to vaccinate my children. And so, like, okay, holy shit, like that's not a good idea. But then she asked me, she's like, so what did the people in your movie say about vaccines? Yeah. What have you learned? And then we had a conversation. I saw her at a later school event a couple months later, and she was like, yeah, so I thought about it, and I'm vaccinating my kids. So it's like those are the cool moments where I think it's the conversations plus evidence that together, you know, it pulls on the feels a little bit more than just hard evidence. So
if there is one criticism of medicine that has a grain of truth to it from, you know, the other side, it is that, at least in my generation, we didn't get a heck of a lot of training with interpersonal relationships with patients. And given that back then I was actually quite shy and not that good at it, it took me a long time of fumbling before I think I got to the point where I was halfway decent at it.
I pulled up, is it okay? I want to read. As I said, I was reviewing my transcripts and then also my course syllabi, and I found a line in the course description of one of my syllabi that this is a counseling class, and I just thought this was really, I just want to read it. So, naturopathic counseling explores the fabric of patient-practitioner relationship, namely how to remain present with patients and to be a midwife to their mental, emotional, spiritual processes as they arise. And I thought that was really, I just wanted to share that because I think it just speaks perfectly to how naturopaths are sort of trained to hold the patient's hand, literally and figuratively, through whatever life may bring them. And so you're not just sitting in the room as the health expert, but you're also sitting there as their emotional support person, their best friend, their...
You know what it is? I've you know what it's being the shaman.
Yeah.
Or the priest. And in fact, it's...
Yeah.
If you look at the history of medicine, you know, back in ancient Egypt, the first physicians were all priests.
Yeah. And so, yeah, so it wasn't uncommon to, you know, sit in a spiritual space with a patient and to provide them with whatever that patient needed, which was sometimes explicit because the patient would ask, or you could make it up, which would feel really good to the patient as well, where you could say, like, you know, I don't know if this is the homeopathic remedy for you, but... You know, and if the patient is scared, that means a lot. And that can really, it doesn't really matter what I give at that point because I've been with this person.
And the impact of that is really clear to see, because how many people do you see, oh yeah, my doctor, he's rubbish, or she's rubbish. I went to see them, I don't really get the feeling that they know what's wrong with me. Whereas on the flip side, I don't think you almost never hear patients of homeopaths and naturopaths say, I'm still ill and it's because my homeopath is rubbish. Even when things go disastrously wrong, you
occasionally do, but
it.
They're the patients who've left.
Yeah, but it's very rare you hear, even when it goes disastrously wrong, you very rarely hear them blame the practitioner. There's always a myriad of other sort of factors at play. I think we have time for one more question, if we have that.
Oh,
Obviously, it's the other end of the room. Come on, let's see how well we can do this.
Multiple passes here.
We can play some sort of musical sound effect to make this a much more game show-like experience. But if the music stops, please don't start tearing into the package because I get the feeling it's rather expensive. One more, brilliant. And then who had it?
You know, after all this, I don't think I really need it. I'm loud enough without. But there is a really interesting question about rhetoric I want to address to all the panel, and about playing dirty or not. And this is a thing that happens in skepticism. We are often the good guys in some respects. Someone comes out with some element of quackery, and you have to politely, if you're talking to the media or whoever, you have to politely explain why this is wrong. And as everyone here knows, the other side don't always play by the same rules. You'll often get intimidation threats, or they'll ring your employer, that's one of their favorite things, and they play quite dirty. And I'll give you a very quick case study and ask what you think, because I'm still conflicted on this. So last year in Ireland, we had an 87% take-up of the HPV vaccine. Then there was a dedicated anti-HPV vaccine movement, sponsored by guys from SaneVax, the same names you see all over the place, that drove uptake down to 50%, because they were getting sympathetic coverage and everything. And I was consulted frequently to go on and try to talk about this. And of course, then they go after you personally and things like that. So no matter what we were saying, the people in medicine and science were saying, we were losing that battle, until a journalist over there said, tell me about the stuff they're doing to you guys. Tell me about the threats to your employer. Tell us about the way they're playing dirty. And I hate talking about that because I don't like to dignify it. But when I did, the journalist ran a story about that and asked loads of senior people in Ireland about this. And the public tide turned very quickly, because suddenly they weren't just concerned parents, they were suddenly manipulative creeps. And that really helped us, because now the vaccine rates are going back up and they're kind of discredited. But I'm still conflicted. Is that something we should do, or should we always take the higher ground and ignore the nasty tactics? I don't know.
We have about a minute for this, so if we can keep our thoughts relatively brief, that'd be wonderful.
I have a similar level of conflict, and I've been the victim of this like many times. I have not been sued, fortunately. I don't know how I've avoided that thus far, but it's gotten to the point where my employers just kind of shrug their shoulders when they get another crank trying to harass me at work. But when that first started happening, it gives you real agita. And then, of course, there's Mike Adams, who has essentially destroyed my Google reputation with about 40 plus articles about me, trying to link me to an oncologist who was in our area who was guilty of massive Medicare fraud, giving chemotherapy to patients who didn't need it, or some of whom didn't even have cancer. So it's...
Yeah. So you've been on the receiving end. Britt, I hear you've been on the receiving end of this kind of treatment too. Do you want to
even
speak to
more
that?
so, I'm guessing.
As a victim of this, I appreciate it being called out. As but covering this as an aspiring writer, I find tricky. So that's not an answer. That's just my personal. That's just my personal experience. But I think what I will say, and for me, perhaps the most important aspect of this is that without it being covered, if the way I was being treated wasn't covered by the mainstream media, I would not be doing this. So from that perspective, I find it empowering, reassuring to know that there's a community out there supporting me, and really necessary as a human.
Right, and just from my perspective, what I would say is that thing that you're talking about, the greatest example I've seen of that really was in Australia, where you had the Australian Vaccination Network, who were regularly all over the media. And then when they started these dirty tricks, and those tricks were really pointed out to the media, they now completely discredited, had to change their name. Meryl Dorey in Australia can't get any airtime anywhere. So I think that's a great testament to how playing dirty can hugely backfire. And for me, that's why we shouldn't be playing dirty. All the dirty tricks from the other side won't discredit their behavior or their point of view in the eyes of the people who support them, but a single dirty trick from our side immediately discredits us in the eyes of the people we're trying to reach. So I think we have to keep fighting with one hand tied behind our back, unfortunately.
Because we have to be better.
We have to try and be the good people.
We have to try. Yeah.
So this was our panel. Thank you very much. Could we all give a huge round of applause for all of our panelists?